She stood very still upon the moonlit terrace of Pembroke House, the ivory silk of her gown shivering faintly in the April air, and she did not weep. Inside, the ballroom blazed with 200 candles, and her own engagement was being toasted in champagne she could not taste. Miss Cordelia Fairchild was 20 years old, and she had just crept to the orangery door, and she had seen a thing that no bride-to-be ought ever to see. Her betrothed with his mouth upon another woman's, and that woman, her cousin. She had not screamed. She had turned. And at the terrace door she had met the eyes of a tall stranger, dressed all in black, a duke she did not know, who had seen precisely what she had seen. Before this night was out, a card would arrive, a carriage would come at 2 a.m, and a gloved hand would be offered to her out of the fog. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. For now, the candles were still burning, and the fiddles were still playing, and Cordelia had not yet decided whether she would step into that carriage or not. Pembroke House was a tall, narrow building of pale Bath stone, and on the evening of the 12th of April its windows blazed as though a second sun had settled in its belly. Every sconce bore a new beeswax taper. Every footman in the Fairchild livery stood in stiff attendance along the walls. The air was thick with the scent of hot wax and hothouse lilies, and the close warmth of too many perfumed bodies in too small a room. At the head of the ballroom, beneath the tall gilded looking-glass that had been her grandmother's, Miss Cordelia Fairchild stood with her gloved hand resting upon the sleeve of Lord Aldrich Thorne. She was a slight figure of 20, and the pale ivory cream silk of her empire waist gown fell to the parquet in a soft pillar, trimmed at the low square neckline with silver thread and seed pearls. A wide silver satin sash bound the gown beneath her bust. Her long honey-blonde hair had been drawn up that afternoon into an elaborate Grecian knot, threaded with small white pearls, and her ivory pale cheeks wore only the faint pink flush that heat and attention had drawn there. A pearl choker lay upon her graceful neck. 2 small teardrop pearls hung at her ears, and on the smallest finger of her left hand, beneath the white silk of her elbow-length glove, she wore her late mother's single gold signet ring. Her cornflower blue eyes were clear and very tired. "Ladies and gentlemen," called Sir Horatio Pembroke from the dais, striking his glass with a silver spoon until the fiddles ceased and the shuffle of slippers upon chalked floor subsided into an expectant hush. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you now to charge your glasses and to drink to the health and happiness of my niece, Miss Cordelia Fairchild, and of her affianced husband, Lord Aldrich Thorne of Thorne Abbey. May their union be as long as it is fortunate, and as fruitful as it is dear." The room made the appropriate noise. 200 pairs of gloved hands lifted 200 glasses, and 200 voices declared, with varying sincerity, the health of the happy pair. Aldrich bent his sandy brown head, cut in the fashionable Brutus style, toward her ear. His shallow hazel-green eyes caught the candlelight and glittered. "You are very pale, my sweet," he murmured. "One would think you were being led to the block." "I am only warm," said Cordelia. "You are the loveliest creature in this room. You shall be the loveliest creature in England before the year is out." He raised her gloved hand and brushed the knuckles with his thin-lipped smile. His bottle-green tailcoat was impeccably cut. His canary-yellow waistcoat, embroidered with tiny gold bees, caught the light at every motion. His cream cravat had been, as usual, carelessly tied. "Smile, Cordelia. They have come to see a bride." She smiled. It was a small, obedient thing, and it cost her nothing because it meant nothing. She had been smiling in precisely that fashion since the age of 12, when her mother had died of a summer fever and her father had followed his wife inside the year, and she had been handed from the quiet house in Kent to the fussy lavender drawing-room of her father's sister, Mrs. Pemberton Fairchild, with a black ribbon in her hair and a trunk of mourning frocks. Mrs. Pemberton Fairchild was watching her now from the second row of chairs, a thin figure in fussy lavender silk, with a lace cap tied under her narrow chin and several gold chains at her throat. Her pale, watery blue eyes moved over her niece with the sharp, proprietary interest of a woman inspecting a piece of porcelain she has, by her own account, rescued from ruin. Beside her, Miss Henrietta Pembroke, Cordelia's cousin, 23, dressed in a vivid coral-pink silk gown, whose gold thread embroidery at the hem winked at every candle, raised her glass to the engaged couple with a smile that was rather too wide and held rather too long. Her dark chestnut hair had been pinned in elaborate corkscrew ringlets at both temples. Her glittering dark brown eyes shone with something that might, to a kinder observer, have been read as cousinly affection. To Cordelia, who had shared a schoolroom with Henrietta since the age of 12, it was not affection. She had known that for some weeks now. She had not, until this evening, admitted it to herself with any precision. The match had been arranged 2 years ago, when Cordelia had turned 18, and the question of what should be done with her had pressed upon her aunt with the urgency of a debt. Lord Aldrich Thorne was the younger son of a baron, with a decayed abbey in Somerset, a string of gambling debts, and a handsome profile. Cordelia was an orphan heiress of modest but respectable fortune, the whole of her father's Fairchild estate, to be settled upon her marriage. Mrs. Pemberton had called it a suitable attachment. Her uncle Sir Horatio had called it a reasonable arrangement. Aldrich, in those early months, had called her many pretty things. He had brought her violets from Covent Garden. He had read Cowper to her in the morning-room. He had said once that her eyes were the colour of the cornflowers along the Kentish lanes, and she had, for nearly a fortnight, believed him. She was thinking, in some distant and rather quiet corner of her mind, that the violets had ceased about a year ago, that the reading of Cowper had given way to a great deal of hurried absence and a great number of small, oblique civilities, that Henrietta, who had once found Aldrich tolerably dull, had lately made a particular study of tying his cravats at breakfast and laughing at his jokes at tea. Cordelia had observed all of this with the patient, half-shut eyes of a woman who had been trained by her aunt never to make a fuss, and she had said nothing, because she had nothing yet to say. "To Lord and Lady Thorne that shall be," said a voice from the second row, with a laugh, and the ballroom drank again. The fiddles struck up. Aldrich led her to the centre of the floor for the opening set, and she moved through the figures of the dance as she had been taught to move through them, lightly, accurately, without expression. His hand was warm through her glove. His shallow green eyes kept sliding past her shoulder as though he was searching for someone in the crowd, and finding her, and losing her again. It was while they turned the second figure that the footman at the great doors cleared his throat and announced, in a voice trained to cut through 100 conversations at once, "His Grace the Duke of Ravensmere." The fiddles did not falter, but several pairs of slippers did. A faint stir ran along the edges of the room, the way a cold draught runs under a door. Heads turned, fans lifted. In the doorway stood a man so entirely dressed in black that for an instant he seemed a cut-out silhouette pasted upon the bright frame of the ballroom. He was very tall, 6'3", Cordelia would later learn, broad at the shoulder, lean at the waist, with the sort of athletic carriage that is earned in saddle and not in drawing-rooms. His jet-black hair was cut short and swept back from a sharp widow's peak. His jaw was sharply sculpted and freshly shaven. His nose was straight and aquiline. His dark, heavy brows lay low over a pair of piercing ice-blue eyes, whose coldness did not suit the warm olive of his skin. A black wool tailcoat of impeccable cut, with a high black velvet collar, a pristine white cravat tied in a mathematical knot and pinned with a single black pearl, a black silk waistcoat with small silver buttons, fitted black breeches, polished Hessian boots with silver tassels, a gold pocket watch chain across the waistcoat, and a heavy gold signet ring bearing a stylized raven upon his right hand, all of it assembled into a single, silent rebuke to the bottle green and canary yellow men around him. "Good God!" said Aldrich under his breath, and his hand upon Cordelia's tightened a fraction. "What is Ravensmere doing here?" "Is he not welcome?" Cordelia asked, turning her head a very little in the dance. "He is welcome everywhere." "That is rather the difficulty." Aldrich laughed too quickly. "One does not expect him. He does not go about. They say he has not set foot in a London ballroom in 3 years." "Then perhaps," said Cordelia, "he's come for the occasion." "Perhaps," said Aldrich, and did not sound pleased. Sir Horatio, recovering himself admirably, bustled forward to greet his unexpected guest. The Duke inclined his head a single careful inch, spoke a few low words in return, and then, with the quiet, unhurried motion of a man who has found a position from which he means to observe without being observed, stepped back to the shadowed pillar beside the great north window, where the candlelight scarcely reached, and there he remained. Cordelia felt his gaze before she understood it as a gaze. It was like standing near a cold fire. She did not turn her head. She finished the figure. She curtsied to Aldrich at the close of the set. She accepted a glass of lemonade from a footman, and did not drink it. Twice, perhaps 3 times, she caught the faint impression of someone watching her from the far corner of the room. And each time she attributed it to nerves, or to the press of the crowd, or to her own unquiet mind, and each time she put it from her. She did not yet know that Lord Julian Ravensmere stood in the shadow of the pillar, with his gloved hand closed so tightly upon the stem of an untouched glass that the pearl-coloured wine trembled in it. Nor that he had known her late father at Cambridge, and had loved that gentle, bookish man with the fierce loyalty of a younger man for his elder. Nor that he had come this evening on the sole errand of seeing her safely betrothed, and had discovered within 5 minutes of his arrival that she was being betrothed to precisely the kind of man whose eyes would not rest upon his bride. "You look faint, my dear," said Mrs. Pemberton, materializing at Cordelia's elbow with her lavender cap ribbons bobbing. "Do not look faint. It is inexcusable to look faint at one's own engagement." "I'm only warm, Aunt," said Cordelia. "You have said so to 3 persons. You will wear the phrase out. Go and take the air, child, for 10 minutes, and when you return I shall expect roses in your cheeks and none of this funeral expression. Mercy me, one would think we had arranged your execution, not your marriage." "No, Aunt," said Cordelia. "You have arranged my marriage." Her aunt, who had not been listening, said, "Quite so, and turned to intercept a passing countess. Cordelia set her untouched glass upon a pier table. She slipped between 2 turning couples, past the card-room door, past the refreshment buffet with its pyramids of jellies and its sweating blocks of ice, and out through the long glass doors at the ballroom's southern end into the cool April night. The terrace was deserted. The Pembroke garden lay below her in terraces of clipped box and gravel walks, silvered by a full moon and rustling faintly under a light breeze. The fiddle music, muffled now by the closed doors, came to her as if from a great distance, from another house, from another life. She drew in a slow, deliberate breath of air that smelled of wet earth and lilac, and she closed her eyes. She stood so for perhaps a minute, then, because the ballroom felt too close to her still, she went down the shallow stone steps into the garden itself. The gravel crunched beneath her silk slippers. She crossed the parterre, turned along the yew walk, and came at length to the long, low glass house at the garden's western wall. The orangery, her uncle's pride, where in winter he coaxed pale fruit from a dozen potted Seville trees. A light burned within. 2 figures moved behind the misted glass. She heard a laugh. She heard a voice she knew. "Peace, you little devil," said Aldrich's voice, low and amused. "They will miss me in 10 minutes. "Let them miss you," said another voice, and that voice Cordelia knew also. "She will not notice. She never notices." Cordelia's feet, which had been carrying her forward with the neutral politeness of a guest who does not wish to intrude, carried her forward now with the cold, automatic obedience of a woman who has heard her own sentence read out and wishes only to be quite certain of the charge. She stepped off the gravel onto the grass at the orangery's side, so that her slippers should make no sound. She came up to the tall glazed door. She looked in. The orangery was warm with the yellow glow of a single oil lamp and fragrant with the close, heavy scent of damp loam and blossom. Against a potted orange tree, its dark leaves glossy, its small white flowers giving off their sweet, tired perfume, stood Lord Aldrich Thorne, with his bottle-green arms wrapped quite unmistakably about the coral-pink waist of Miss Henrietta Pembroke. His mouth was upon hers. Her gold comb had slipped askew in her chestnut ringlets. One of her long cream gloves lay upon the stone floor beside the tree. His fingers were splayed at the small of her back in the attitude of a man who is neither surprised by the geography nor new to the journey. Cordelia did not scream. She did not gasp. She did not drop her fan. She did not sway. She had been trained by a decade of lavender silk and pinched lace caps not to be the occasion of any fuss. The part of her that might have cried out had been put, long ago, into a drawer, and the key mislaid. She stood, instead, very still. She looked. She saw. She took it in. The angle of his head. The smile that tilted Henrietta's thin coral lips even beneath his mouth. The brief, pleased laugh that escaped her cousin when Aldrich moved to kiss her throat. She registered these things as a woman registers the details of a room she is about to leave forever. Then she turned. She walked back along the grass so that her slippers made no sound, and onto the gravel walk where they made a little sound, and up the shallow stone steps to the terrace. She did not hurry. She did not slow. She moved at precisely the pace of a young lady returning from a breath of air before the second set, and in her face there was no more expression than there had been upon the dance floor. At the terrace door she stopped, because a man was standing in it. He had come out silently as he seemed to do most things, and he stood now with his gloved hand upon the door frame and his tall black figure cut against the glow of the ballroom behind him. His piercing ice-blue eyes were fixed upon hers, and they were not cold. They were not quite warm either. They were the eyes of a man who had just been reading a book he had hoped very much not to read, and had closed it carefully, and was looking now at the only other person in the room who could also read. She understood at once, she understood without a word exchanged, that he had seen. Whether from this terrace, whether from a window, whether from the shadow of some path she had not noticed in her haste, she did not know. She knew only that the Duke of Ravensmere had stood somewhere in this garden in the last quarter hour, and that he had looked into the orangery, and that his quiet mouth told her everything the rest of his face would not. "Miss Fairchild," he said, in a voice so low she had to lean a little to catch it. It was the first time she had heard it. It was a deep voice, smooth, faintly rough at the edges, like good wool. "Your Grace." He offered her his arm. The black wool of his sleeve was very fine. The gold raven on his signet ring caught the candlelight from the ballroom doors. "I shall see you back inside," he said, "if you will permit it." She looked at his arm. She looked at his face. She did not take the arm. "I thank you, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, and her cornflower eyes were perfectly clear. "But I am quite able to walk in alone. He inclined his head. A single careful inch, precisely as he had inclined it to Sir Horatio, and he stepped aside, and he let her pass. She walked into the ballroom alone. The fiddles were striking up a new set. Her aunt caught her eye from across the room and made a small, approving nod at the colour that had come, at last, into her niece's cheeks. Lord Aldrich Thorne was nowhere to be seen, nor, for that matter, was Miss Henrietta Pembroke, though neither absence had yet been remarked. Cordelia accepted the hand of a young lieutenant she scarcely knew. She danced the set. She danced the next, and the next. She smiled when smiled at. She laughed once at a joke she did not hear. She accepted a second glass of lemonade, and this time she drank it, because her mouth had gone suddenly dry, and she did not wish the tremor of her hand to be remarked. Between the figures of the third set, she caught sight of her cousin slipping in through the terrace doors on the arm of an elderly gentleman from Shropshire. Henrietta had, it seemed, contrived to be discovered taking the air in respectable company, and Cordelia, meeting her cousin's glittering dark eyes across the heads of the dancers, inclined her head with the small, cousinly civility she had given all evening. Henrietta's coral-pink lips parted in readiness for whatever explanation she had prepared, then closed again in visible confusion. It did not seem to have occurred to her that her cousin might not ask. When Aldrich at length reappeared, his cravat tidied and his sandy hair smoothed, and came to claim her for the supper dance, she placed her gloved hand upon his sleeve and let him lead her out. His shallow green eyes searched her face with a flicker of uncertainty, as though he had expected to find something there and had not found it. She gave him nothing. She gave him the same polite, absent smile she had given him for 2 years, and he, reassured by its familiarity, bent his head and murmured some small gallantry she did not hear. And no one in all that bright crowded room, no one save one silent black-clad figure by the north pillar, whose ice-blue eyes never left her, could have told from her face that anything at all had happened in the orangery that night. Morning came to Pembroke House without mercy. A thin grey light crept between the heavy damask curtains of Cordelia's chamber and laid itself along the coverlet like a hand she had not invited. She had not slept. She had sat upright against the carved oak bedhead for most of the night in her shift, her honey-blonde hair loose and tumbling past her shoulder blades, the pearl choker set upon the dressing-table in a small pale coil, and watched the coals in the grate go from red to ash to nothing at all. At some point, near 4, she had lit a candle, mended a pen, and drawn from the little rosewood desk beside the window a single sheet of cream-laid paper. The letter took her 3 attempts. The first was a storm, and she flung it into the grate. The second was a plea, and she tore it in halves. The third, at last, was cold, and cold was the thing she wanted. "My lord," she wrote, "I have witnessed on the evening of our engagement that which I cannot unknow and will not ignore. I release you without rancour from every promise you have made to me, as I release myself from every promise I have made to you. I shall inform my aunt this morning. Your obedient servant, Cordelia Fairchild." She did not sign it with love. She had, she discovered, never signed a letter to him with love, and only now did she wonder at it. She folded the sheet, pressed it flat with the heel of her hand, and sealed it with a drop of black wax. She did not use the Fairchild signet. She could not bring herself to press her late mother's gold ring into a document that concerned Lord Aldrich Thorne. She used a plain seal, unlettered, such as a housekeeper might keep for a bill. By 7 she had dressed herself without ringing for a maid. A sprigged muslin morning gown, the colour of new cream, a narrow lavender ribbon at the high waist, her hair drawn back into a loose knot. She went down to the breakfast parlour with the letter in her hand, and the whole of her small, still courage gathered into the hand that held it. Mrs. Pemberton Fairchild was already at table. She sat very upright in her fussy lavender silk, a lace cap pinned over her faded ash-blonde hair, the multiple gold chains at her throat catching the watery morning light. Her pale, watery blue eyes lifted from the letter she was reading. A letter Cordelia saw, in her aunt's own hand, not yet sealed, addressed in flourishes to Lord Aldrich Thorne. "You are pale, my dear," Mrs. Pembroke said. "Sit, eat. Mrs. Dray has sent up kippers." "Aunt, I must speak to you." "Sit first. A standing conversation is a vulgar one." Cordelia did not sit. She laid her folded letter upon the white linen beside her aunt's teacup. "This is for Lord Aldrich," she said. "I wish it sent this morning. I release him from our engagement." There was a long silence that was not silence, but the small, infuriated ticking of the carriage clock on the mantel and the tiny fizz of the kippers in their dish. Mrs. Pembroke did not pick up the letter. She did not even look at it. She looked at Cordelia, and her permanently dissatisfied mouth thinned into something very like a smile. "No," she said. "Aunt, no, Cordelia, sit down. I saw him, in the orangery, with Henrietta. I have no doubt you saw something that disturbed you, child. Young men are unsteady creatures. You will learn to close your eyes to a great many things once you are married. The settlements, as you know, have been signed. The wedding is in 3 weeks. The breakfast is ordered. The lace for your veil is come up from Brussels. The notices have gone to every paper in London. You will not shame this family upon a kitchen-maid rumour." "It was not a rumour, Aunt. I saw—" "You saw," said Mrs. Pembroke, what a girl of 20 sees at midnight, upon champagne, in a glass-house full of shadows. Sit down, my dear. Drink your tea. I have already written to Lord Aldrich, yes, this morning, to apprise him of your distress, and he has replied by the early post that he is on his way to us even now. You will meet him in the yellow drawing-room. You will take his hand, and you will remember that he has honoured you with a proposal which any girl of your portion ought to have taken upon her knees." Cordelia felt the blood leave her face, and then, very slowly, returned to it. "My portion," she said. £38,000, child, is a portion. Sit down. You wrote to him before I came down." "Naturally, I wrote to him. I saw your face last night when you came in from the terrace. I am not blind. I am merely not hysterical." Her aunt at last picked up the folded letter with 2 fingers, as though it were a scrap to be sent to the grate, and laid it neatly beneath her own. "There. It shall go where it belongs. Eat, Cordelia. You will need your strength." Cordelia did not eat. She did not sit. She turned on her heel upon the turkey carpet and walked out. In the long corridor between the breakfast parlour and the foot of the stairs, she came face to face with her cousin. Henrietta Pembroke had not slept either, but Henrietta had the gift of wearing a sleepless night as an ornament. Her dark chestnut hair was already pinned into the elaborate corkscrew ringlets at each temple that she favoured. A little calculated pink rouge was dabbed high upon her cheekbones. Her thin coral-pink lips were already curved. She wore a deep rose morning gown and coral eardrops, and she leaned in the corridor with one shoulder against the panelling, as though she had been waiting. "Good morning, cousin," Henrietta said. Cordelia made to pass her. Henrietta put out one slender gloved hand and laid it, very lightly, upon Cordelia's sleeve. "Do not hurry, dearest. We have so much to say to one another." "I think we have nothing to say." "Oh, but we have. We have a whole year to say." Henrietta's glittering dark brown eyes held Cordelia's in a bright, merciless way. "You saw us last night. I know you did. I saw you see us. And I would not, for the world, have you labour under any misunderstanding. You see, my dear, it is not a flirtation. It is not an indiscretion. It has been, let me see, a year this April, since before your engagement was announced, since the Easter ball, if you care to mark it in your diary." Cordelia did not speak. "He will marry you, of course." Henrietta went on lightly. "Your £38,000 is a great deal too much to refuse, and his estate, poor lamb, has been eaten quite to the bone by his father's cards. But you will live at Thornley, in Shropshire, and Aldrich will live in London, and when you have given him an heir he shall set you up with your gardens and your charities, and think of you fondly, I am sure, upon occasion. And I—" Henrietta gave the smallest, sweetest smile, "shall have the house in Half Moon Street. The lease is already in hand. Henrietta, I do not tell you to wound you, dearest. I tell you because one ought to be honest between cousins, and because I had rather you did not spoil things by making a scene. You have not the temperament for scenes. You never had." Cordelia found her voice. It came out very level. "You are wicked," she said. "I am clear-eyed," Henrietta said. "It is a different thing. Now go and wash your face. He comes at 11. She stepped aside with the prettiest curtsy and let Cordelia pass. Cordelia did not go to her chamber. She went first to the library and tried the door that led through to the garden. It was locked. She went to the side passage that led out to the mews. A footman stood at the end of it in his green livery, a tall young man she did not know, who bowed to her and did not move. She went to the front hall. Grimes the butler was at the door. She asked, quite pleasantly, for her bonnet and her pelisse, as she wished to walk in the square. "Mrs. Pembroke's orders, miss," Grimes said, and would not meet her eye. "Miss Fairchild is not to go out today. Miss Fairchild is unwell." "I am not unwell. Mrs. Pembroke's orders, miss." She went to the little writing-room at the back of the house and tried the window. It had been pinned. She went to her uncle's study. Her uncle, Mr. Pembroke, who was a kind, vague, indolent man, and who might, if she could reach him, have been moved to pity, and found it locked, and remembered, with a cold, small lurch of the stomach, that he had set out for Edinburgh 3 days since, and would not return for a fortnight. She stood very still in the passage outside his study. She understood then, with a clarity she had not possessed at breakfast, that she was not a niece in this house. She was a piece of furniture upon which her aunt had set a price. Aldrich arrived at 11, as promised. She heard his voice in the hall. That smooth, slightly nasal drawl that had once seemed so easy and now, at the first syllable, turned her stomach. She did not go down. Her aunt came up. There was an interview in the yellow drawing-room that Cordelia would not afterwards remember in detail. Aldrich solemn, a little injured, his hazel-green eyes damp upon cue, his weak chin set in what he plainly believed to be a noble expression. Her aunt gracious. Cordelia herself silent at the window, turning her mother's small gold signet ring upon her smallest finger and watching a sparrow in the plane tree and saying, "Yes, no yes," as was required of her. When he took her hand at the door and pressed her gloved knuckles to his thin-lipped smile, she did not flinch, because she had already, somewhere in the hour, gone very far away inside herself. He left at 12:30, well pleased. Her aunt watched him into his carriage, and then turned upon Cordelia, with the kindly, relieved air of a woman who has successfully stopped a nursery tantrum. "There now, my dear. Was it so dreadful? Go and lie down until dinner." Cordelia went to her room. She did not lie down. She sat at the window and watched the day go grey, and the grey go to dusk, and the dusk to the thickening white fog that rolled in from the river. It was 4:30 when a card was brought up to her. Annie, the under-housemaid, brought it. A small, sullen girl, whom Cordelia had once given a shilling when her mother was ill, and who therefore was, alone in this house, not entirely her aunt's. Annie slipped into the chamber without announcing herself, glanced once over her shoulder, and held out a small black-bordered card upon a little plate. "Come not half a minute ago, miss. Groom on a dark horse, wouldn't give a name, said it was for you only, miss, and I was to put it into your own hand. Cordelia took the card. It was plain, heavy pasteboard, the black border very narrow and very crisp, a single line of direction upon the front, Miss Fairchild. She turned it over. The writing on the reverse was in black ink, in a crisp, sloping, masculine hand that she had never seen before and that she somehow knew at once. Your father was my friend. A carriage will be on Pembroke Lane at 2:00 in the morning. If you choose to enter it, my sister awaits you at Ravensmere Hall. Ravensmere. She read it twice. The second time her hands were quite steady, which surprised her. Thank you, Annie, she said. You have seen nothing. No, miss, said Annie, and dropped a small curtsy, and went. Cordelia sat a long moment with the card in her lap. Then she rose, crossed to the fire, and laid the card upon the coals. The black border caught first. The ink blackened and vanished. She watched until there was nothing but a soft white curl of ash, and then she took up the poker and stirred the ash into the rest. She went down to dinner at 7. Her aunt noted, with satisfaction, that she had colour in her cheeks. Henrietta, across the table in her coral silk, watched her over the rim of a wineglass with an expression of faintly puzzled dissatisfaction, as of a cat who has set a trap and cannot understand why the mouse appears to be humming. Cordelia ate nothing. She pushed a little soup about a plate. She drank half a glass of hock. She answered, when spoken to, in a low and perfectly civil voice. You seem quite recovered, child, Mrs. Pembroke said over the almond pudding. I am quite recovered, aunt. I knew you would be sensible. Yes, aunt. At 10 she wished them both good night upon the landing. Henrietta, with a little laugh, leaned in and kissed the air beside her cheek. Cordelia did not draw back. She went into her chamber and closed the door, and set her back against it, and stood there a long moment with her eyes shut. Then she opened them, and began. She did not light more than a single candle. She took, from the top of the press, a small round hat-box of plain pasteboard bound in brown holland, the cheapest thing in her possession, a thing no thief would look at twice upon a coach. Into it she laid, folded small, one muslin gown, the most modest she owned, a spare pair of stockings, a clean chemise, a cake of lavender soap wrapped in paper. She laid upon them her mother's ivory-backed hairbrush, which she would not leave behind, and upon that her little leather prayer book with the silver clasp, given her at her confirmation. In the small velvet case at the bottom, she placed two things: the miniature of her father in its gold oval frame, painted when he was 24 and newly married, his blue eyes laughing, and her mother's pearl necklet that had been set aside for her wedding day, that she did not now intend to wear for the wedding that had been arranged. Her mother's gold signet she left upon her finger. She closed the hat-box and tied the cords. At midnight she changed her gown. She laid aside the muslin she had worn to dinner and dressed herself in a plain dark green travelling gown that was 3 years old and had, therefore, not been inventoried in her trousseau. She pinned up her hair simply, without ornament. She drew her long, dark grey travelling cloak about her shoulders and fastened it at the throat with a plain bone clasp. She looked once in the glass. A pale, slight, wide-eyed girl looked back, and Cordelia, with a small surprised lift of the chin, was glad of her. Glad, at last, to be her. At 1:45, she blew out the candle. She took the hat-box in her left hand. She opened the chamber door by degrees, listening to each small click of the latch as a musician listens to a string. The corridor was dark and cold. The house slept. She went down the service stair in her stockinged feet, her slippers in her pocket, and paused at the bottom to put them on. The green baize door into the scullery passage opened under her hand without a sound. Annie, she thought, with a sudden hot pricking in the eyes, had oiled it. She crossed the scullery. She lifted the iron bar from the back door. She stepped out into the area, climbed the 5 worn steps to the pavement, and closed the iron gate behind her with the softest click she had ever made in her life. The fog was a white wall. It had filled the street from cobble to chimney, and Pembroke Lane, the narrow service way that ran along the side of the house and connected with the mews, was a tunnel of soft whiteness in which a single iron lamp-post shed a yellow pool the size of a shilling. She walked to the pool of light, set her hat box at her feet, and waited. The cold came through her cloak. She did not shiver. She stood very straight, her honey-blonde head a little bowed, her gloved hands folded one over the other at her waist, and she counted, to steady herself, the slow, small dripping of water from the iron railing behind her. 1, 2, 3, 4. Somewhere in the fog, a bell struck 2, and out of the white, upon the cobbles, she heard at last the muffled, regular beat of hoofs at a walk, and the soft grind of well-sprung wheels, and then, rounding the corner of the mews, a black lacquered carriage drew into the pool of yellow lamplight like a ship coming to a quay. 4 black horses, their breath rising in white plumes, a silent coachman upon the box, caped, his hat pulled low, no crest upon the panel. Only when the carriage stopped and the lamp caught it at the right angle, the faintest incised device upon the door, a stylized raven, no larger than a thumbnail. The door opened from within. A single lantern burned inside the carriage, turned low. By its thin yellow light she saw him, the Duke of Ravensmere, seated upon the far cushion, his jet-black head bent a little beneath the roof, his piercing ice-blue eyes in shadow beneath the heavy dark brows, his olive-toned skin pale in the lamp. He wore a heavy black caped greatcoat buttoned high against the cold, and black leather driving gloves, and at his throat she saw the white edge of a fresh cravat, pinned with a single black pearl. He did not speak. He did not smile. His firm mouth was set in the still, unreadable line she remembered from the terrace door. He leaned forward, and he put out his right hand to her, gloved, palm up, without a word. She looked at the hand. She looked once at the grey bulk of Pembroke House behind her in the fog, where her aunt slept, and her cousin slept, and the yellow drawing-room held still in it the ghost of Lord Aldrich's thin-lipped smile. She set her hat-box upon the carriage step. She laid her small gloved hand into his. His fingers closed about hers, steady, firm, and warm even through the leather. He drew her up into the carriage with no more effort than a man turning a page. She sank upon the cushion opposite him. He reached past her, without touching her, and drew the door shut. The soft click of the latch was the loudest sound she had heard since midnight. He rapped once, lightly, upon the roof with his knuckles. The carriage moved. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The lamp swung a little upon its hook, the fog closed white about the windows, and the lamps of Pembroke Lane passed one by one in soft, blurred suns and were gone. She sat with her hands in her lap and her hat-box on the seat beside her, and felt, for the first time in all the hours since she had seen her cousin against the orange trees, her breath come properly back into her body. At last, without turning his head from the window, he spoke. His voice was low and very quiet and quite level. "You are safe, Miss Fairchild," he said. She did not trust herself to answer. She only inclined her head. He did not press her. He sat opposite her in the swaying lamplight, his gloved hands folded upon his knee, his face half in shadow, and let the silence be a kindness. Outside the window the fog thinned and thinned again, and the horses' hoofs made a muffled, steady music upon the cobbles. And then, as the carriage swung at last out of the narrow streets and onto the broader post-road north, into a rougher, plainer rhythm upon packed earth, London fell away behind them in the white. Somewhere, far off, A watchman cried the hour. The black lacquered carriage, with its small raven upon the door, and its single lantern burning low, went on into the dark toward the country and toward the grey dawn that was, though she did not yet know it, already gathering above the long avenue of limes at Ravensmere Hall. The fog that had clung to the carriage wheels all through the last stages of the journey thinned at last as the road climbed, and when Cordelia drew back the leather curtain with a gloved finger, she saw Ravensmere Hall rise out of the mist like something dreamt. It was a long, grey, austere pile of Tudor stone, with tall mullioned windows set deep in its face, and a slate roof pricked with a dozen chimneys, smoking pale against a paler sky. A pair of stone ravens with spread wings topped the gateposts. The drive was of raked gravel. The elms along it stood in bare black ranks, and the rooks in their high nests were already speaking to one another in the dawn. The Duke had not spoken above 10 words since the carriage rolled out of London. He had sat opposite her in his black wool travelling coat, one gloved hand resting on the silver head of a walking stick, his ice-blue eyes fixed mostly upon the curtain or the floor, as though the simple courtesy of not looking at her were a gift he meant to make her. Once, when the carriage struck a deep rut and Cordelia had been flung a little sideways, he had put out a hand to steady her without touching her, and then withdrawn it when she had righted herself, and said only, "Forgive the roads, Miss Fairchild." She had inclined her head. She had not been able, in the dimness, to tell whether he looked at her then or not. Now, as the carriage swung round the last sweep of gravel and drew up beneath a stone porte-cochere, the great door at the top of the steps opened before a footman could come down to it, and a tall woman in a dove-grey silk wrapper came out upon the flags with a branch of candles in her hand. She had dark, glossy chestnut hair, caught back in a simple chignon, warm grey eyes, and a firm, handsome mouth that did not trouble itself with a smile of welcome, but set itself at once to the business of kindness. "My dear," said Lady Beatrix Ravensmere, as the footman handed Cordelia down, "come in from the cold. Julian, see to the horses and then go and sleep, for heaven's sake. You look like a corpse." "Beatrix," the Duke said, I know everything you wish to say, and none of it needs saying at 4 o'clock in the morning. Miss Fairchild, my name is Beatrix. I am Julian's sister. You are to consider yourself my guest. Mrs. Haddon has a fire laid and a hot brick in the bed, and a posset on the hob, and if you faint in the hall, I shall be very much put out. So come along." Cordelia, who had not eaten since the day before, and had not wept once, and had carried her hat-box herself out of some obscure pride, found that she was suddenly shaking very hard. Lady Beatrix set the branch of candles upon a side table, took the hat-box gently out of her hand, and passed her arm through hers, as though they had been schoolfellows for 20 years. "There," she said. "Up we go." The rooms to which Beatrix took her were at the east end of the house, behind a pair of white-painted doors, set in a panelled corridor, hung with faded tapestry. There was a small sitting-room, with a blue damask sofa, and a writing-table beneath the window. Beyond it, a bedchamber done in old rose silk, with a tall canopied bed and a dressing-room, and in the wall between them a white marble chimney-piece, carved with small pomegranates and doves. "These were my mother's," Beatrix said, as she drew back the bed-curtains. "They have been shut up a long while. We have had them aired for a week. Julian gave the order the morning after the ball." Cordelia said, "A week? He has been hoping you would come," said Beatrix. And she said it so simply that Cordelia sat down upon the edge of the bed and looked at her hands in their white silk gloves, and did not know what to answer. Beatrix sat down beside her. She did not take her hand. She was not, Cordelia would come to learn, a woman who put her hands upon other people without invitation. But she turned her face towards her and said, quite low, "You are owed an explanation, and I had rather give it to you now and have done. My brother has known of Lord Aldrich's attachment to Miss Henrietta Pembroke for 6 months. The knowledge reached him by way of a servant who had served his own house and then yours. He could not bring it to you. You would have thought it malice, you would have thought it the spite of a stranger, and your aunt would have shut you up in the country within the week, so he waited. He hoped you would see for yourself what he had seen, in time and without ruin. And last night at the ball, when I watched you upon your betrothed's arm and saw, my dear, how entirely unloved you were by the man who stood beside you, I told him it was time. Cordelia's throat was tight. She said after a moment, "He has never spoken 3 words to me." "No," said Beatrix, "he would not. He felt he had no right. And now—" "Now," said Beatrix, "you are under his roof, and he has no right still, and he knows it. You will find him. Difficult. He was a silent boy, and he is a silent man. Do not mistake silence for indifference, and do not, I beg you, mistake kindness for a demand." She rose. She kissed Cordelia once, very lightly upon the crown of the head, as an aunt might kiss a tired niece. "Sleep as long as you can. The bell by the bed will bring Mrs. Haddon. No one will trouble you. No one will find you here. You are safe, my dear." She went out and drew the door softly behind her, and Cordelia, who had meant to sit up a little and think, fell sideways upon the counterpane in her travelling cloak and her half-unlaced half-boots, and slept. She slept for 18 hours. When she woke, it was dusk of the following day. The fire had been built up twice without her knowing it. A tray of broth and white bread stood covered on the table by the window, and a plain muslin wrapper had been laid across the foot of the bed. For a long moment she did not know where she was. A wood-pigeon was calling somewhere beyond the window, and a clock on the landing was striking the half-hour with a slow, deliberate chime she did not recognize. Then she remembered, and lay very still in the old rose silk and listened to the rooks coming home to the elms, and thought that she had perhaps not so much been rescued as set down in a quiet place, like a parcel, until someone should know what to do with her. She ate a little of the broth. It was good broth, made with barley and thyme, and the bread was still warm. She drew back the curtain and saw the lawns running down to a ha-ha, and beyond the ha-ha a grey shimmer of park, and beyond the park, very faintly, the dark line of a wood. There was no carriage upon the drive. There was no sound of a bell. There was no Aldrich, and no Henrietta, and no aunt in lavender silk rising from a chair to demand her attendance in the breakfast parlour. She sat down at the writing table with the broth in her hand, and found that she did not, for the moment, know how to be a person to whom nothing was about to happen. The days that followed were of that same strange quality. Ravensmere Hall was enormous and cold and austere, and it was also, quietly, almost shyly, kind. The fires in her rooms were built before she came down. A small book appeared one morning on her writing table, a pocket volume of Cowper, much thumbed, with no note, a bowl of late roses, white ones, turned up on her breakfast tray on the 3rd day. She did not see the Duke put them there. She did not see him put anything anywhere. He dined at the far end of the long mahogany table in the great dining-room, a distance of some 24 feet, so that she could hardly hear him speak above the ticking of the long case clock. He rode out at dawn, before she was awake, upon a tall black horse called Corbeau. He passed her in corridors with the smallest of bows and the briefest of "Miss Fairchild." When she thanked him, at last, for the Cowper, he said only, "It was my mother's. I thought it might be of use," and went away. "Do not be offended," said Beatrix, who had found her in the long gallery after one of these encounters, standing before a portrait of a severe, dark-haired woman in Vandyke silk. "He is not avoiding you. He is avoiding appearing to court you. He will not have you feel you owe him any return, and so he removes the occasion for one. "It is very annoying. I have told him as much." "I do not know what to make of him," Cordelia said. "No one does," Beatrix said. "I have been making something of him for 38 years, and I am not yet finished. Come, you have seen enough grandmothers. I will teach you backgammon." And by such small doors she drew Cordelia out, the library, a long room of polished oak shelves running up to a fretted ceiling, with a tall window at the south end and 2 great wing chairs by the hearth, became the place they met after dinner. Beatrix rattled the dice in the ivory cup and told her of a small, dark-eyed boy who had broken his arm falling out of the elm at the bottom of the orchard and would not cry because his father was watching, of the same boy at 10, carrying a half-drowned spaniel 3 miles home through sleet, of him at 19, home from his first term at Oxford, reading Virgil aloud to his mother in her last illness, because she had said she liked the sound of his voice. She told these things without reverence, as one tells the small comic facts of a brother, and Cordelia, laughing once or twice in spite of herself, began to understand that the man who bowed to her in corridors had been a child and a youth, and was at last a man, and that he was not a figure out of a black engraving, but a person who had broken his arm out of pride and carried a dog in his coat. The portrait gallery they walked one rainy afternoon, Beatrix carrying a branch of candles because the clouds had come down over the park and turned the long room to twilight. Ravensmeres hung there in their ruffs and their powdered wigs and their hussar braid, 200 years of them, none smiling. And at the far end, between 2 windows, hung a smaller canvas of a dark-haired woman in pale green silk, with her hand upon the shoulder of a boy of perhaps 12. The boy looking not at the painter, but up at her, and the woman's mouth just beginning to curve. "My mother," Beatrix said, "and Julian. She died the year after it was painted. He does not care to stop before it. He comes here alone at night sometimes, my maid tells me, and stands a long while. Do not mention to him that I have shown it to you." "I will not," Cordelia said. "Come," said Beatrix. "You have seen enough of us. I will have tea sent up to my sitting room, and I will read you a very silly letter from my daughter Sophie, who is with her grandmother in Bath and has fallen in love with a pony." There was a backgammon board of ebony and ivory that had belonged to their grandfather, and Beatrix taught her the game patiently, and Cordelia, who had always been quick at figures, began to beat her within a week. There was a little terrier called Nettle, who attached himself to Cordelia on the 3rd day and followed her along the corridors, the click of his claws on the boards the only sound behind her. There was a spinet in a disused morning room, out of tune, on which Cordelia picked out an air she had learned as a girl and which she had not played in 4 years. When she turned from the keys, she found Mrs. Haddon, the housekeeper, standing in the doorway with an armful of fresh linen and tears in her eyes, and Mrs. Haddon only said, "Forgive me, miss, it has been long since there was music in the house," and went away. Meanwhile, 120 miles to the south, London was lighting itself on her. In the drawing-room of Lady Castleton in Grosvenor Square, 3 mornings after the engagement ball, 5 ladies sat over chocolate and the Morning Post, and the Post lay open at the 2nd page, where, between the births and the naval promotions, Mrs. Pemberton Fairchild and Lord Aldrich Thorne had together caused to be inserted a short paragraph announcing with great regret that Miss Cordelia Fairchild had been taken since the night of the 12th in a fit of nervous hysteria and had been removed for her recovery to the care of medical friends in the country, where she was to remain, quite incommunicado, until her health should be restored. "Hysteria," said Lady Castleton over the rim of her cup, "on the very morning after her engagement ball. How extremely inconvenient for Lord Aldrich." "My dear Louisa," said Mrs. Carmichael, "one does not lose one's wits between one's soup and one's breakfast without a reason." "One does not lose one's wits at all in that family," said a 3rd lady, a thin, clever widow named Mrs. Sherborne. I knew her mother. There was nothing hysterical about her. She was the coolest-headed woman in 3 counties. Well, said Lady Castleton, and yet. At this moment, the door opened and Miss Henrietta Pembroke was announced. She came in upon a rustle of coral-pink silk, the corkscrew ringlets at her temples freshly dressed, her thin lips set in a careful expression of cousinly sorrow. She was kissed, condoled with, placed in the best chair, and given chocolate. And when she had sipped it twice, she set down the cup and laid her hand upon Lady Castleton's sleeve, and said, with the air of one imparting a confidence under great distress, "Dear Louisa, I cannot bear that you should read such a paragraph and think ill of my poor cousin. The truth is, it is not hysteria at all. It is so much worse." "My dear child," Lady Castleton said, "you must tell us nothing you should not." "I must tell you everything," said Henrietta, "for if I do not, the world will invent it, and the invention will be crueler than the truth. My poor Cordelia. The engagement was not to her taste. There had been some months, another. A gentleman not received in our houses. She has gone to him. She left a note upon her pillow. We are not to speak of it. My aunt has forbidden it. But it is so. And Aldrich, poor Aldrich, bears it like a saint." The 5 ladies set down their cups. Not one of them believed her entirely. Not one of them disbelieved her entirely either. That was sufficient. By 4 o'clock, the story was in Hanover Square. By the following morning, in Brook Street. By Sunday, mouthed from behind fans in every pew of St. George's. A name was wanted for the hypothetical lover, and 6 names were tried and discarded and reissued. Lord Aldrich Thorne was seen at White's that week, carrying himself with the pale dignity of a man who has been cruelly used, and was clapped upon the shoulder by gentlemen who had never particularly liked him, and permitted himself a brave, small smile. Mrs. Pemberton Fairchild took to her bed with a bottle of sal volatile and received only her intimates, to whom she spoke in a broken voice of ingratitude and of the serpent she had nursed in her bosom these 6 years. Not once in any of these drawing-rooms was the Duke of Ravensmere's name spoken, for he had no intimates in London, and had not been seen in town for a fortnight, and was, in any case, generally held to be a man whose notice one did not attempt to draw. At Ravensmere Hall, Cordelia knew none of this. She knew only that on the 6th evening after her arrival, a gust of wind rattled the library window, the fire in the great hearth fell in upon itself in a shower of red, and the Duke of Ravensmere, who had said good night at dinner and retreated to his study as he always did, came unexpectedly through the far door with a sheaf of papers in his hand, saw that she was there, and paused. He was in his shirt-sleeves and a dark silk waistcoat. His cravat had been loosened. In that softer dress, without his tailcoat, he looked younger and more tired, and less like an engraving. He bowed. "Forgive me. I thought the room empty." "Pray do not go on my account," Cordelia said. He hesitated. Then he crossed to the opposite wing chair, laid his papers on the small table between them, and sat. For a time, he did not speak. He looked at the fire. Cordelia looked at him, and felt that she could at last look at him, and that this too was a kind of gift he had made her by silence. "My lord," she said at length, "Miss Fairchild, I should like to ask you something, and I should like you to answer me truly, for I have been in your house for 7 days, and I do not yet know what I am doing in it. Ask. Why have you taken the trouble?" He did not answer at once. A log shifted in the grate. A rook called once outside the south window and fell silent. He set his hands upon the arms of the chair, long brown hands, the heavy gold signet with its stylized raven catching the firelight. And he looked not at her, but into the flames, and he said, "Because your father once pulled me from a river, Miss Fairchild, and because I have never owed a debt and left it unpaid." He said it very evenly. He said it as a man says a thing he has rehearsed in his own mind, alone, a great many times, against the moment when it should be asked. Cordelia waited. She thought, at first, that he would add something, a date, a river, a year. He did not. He sat quite still, his eyes upon the fire, and the only thing that moved in him at all was the pulse that beat, once, visibly in the strong brown line of his throat above the loosened cravat. "I see," she said. "Do you?" "I think so. I am glad of it." But she did not see, and he knew she did not see, and she knew he knew. The answer he had given her was true. She did not doubt that it was true. It was simply not all the truth. And he had not pretended that it was. He had given her the portion of it that a gentleman might give a young woman under his roof, and he had left the rest unnamed. And in the ice-blue eyes that did not turn to meet hers, there was something steady, patient, terribly quiet, that he would not name either, and that she, for the first time in her cloistered and obedient life, understood she was now obliged to begin to name for herself. She rose. He rose at once. "Good night, my lord." "Good night, Miss Fairchild." She went to the door. At the threshold she paused, her gloved hand upon the latch, and she looked back. He was standing where she had left him, in his shirt sleeves, one hand resting upon the back of the chair, the firelight upon the side of his face, and he was looking at her now. And she saw in that look, plainly, the thing he would not name. And she went out of the library into the dim panelled corridor, and closed the door behind her, and stood a long moment in the dark with her hand pressed flat against the wood, and her heart beating as it had not beaten since she was a child. 3 mornings later, the sky over Ravensmere lay low and iron-coloured, and a borrowed curricle came up the long avenue at a pace that told its own story. The horses were blown, the varnish on the wheels was scratched from hard driving, and on the box beside Lord Aldrich Thorne sat a small, anxious man in a rusty black coat, who clutched a leather case upon his knees as though it contained the last commandment of the English law. Aldrich himself wore his bottle-green coat and the canary waistcoat with the little gold bees, and the bees looked, in that grey northern light, rather less like bees and rather more like insects that had flown in by mistake and could not now escape the room. Mr. Hodge opened the door before the bell was rung. He had been standing in the hall for half an hour, polishing a salver that did not need polishing, because his master had said, quietly at breakfast, that he expected a visitor before noon, and that the visitor would not be announced in the usual way. "Lord Aldrich Thorne," said Aldrich, stepping past him as though the valet were a hat-stand, "and Mr. Paget, my solicitor. I will see the Duke at once." "His Grace," said Mr. Hodge, without inflection, "is in the great hall." He meant it as a direction and as a warning. Aldrich missed the warning. He walked ahead of his solicitor down the stone-flagged corridor, his boot heels ringing, and came out into the vast old hall of Ravensmere, a room designed 4 centuries earlier to humble ambassadors. And there, at the far end, standing before the cold hearth with his hands behind his back, was Julian. He had dressed for it: the black coat, the high velvet collar, the mathematical knot of the cravat, pinned with its single black pearl. He did not come forward. He did not offer his hand. He simply watched Aldrich cross the length of the hall as a man might watch a moth cross a window. "Ravensmere," said Aldrich, and tried to put heartiness into it, and failed. "This is an extraordinary business. I have come for my affianced wife." "You have come," said Julian, a considerable distance for a conversation that need not take very long. "Mr. Paget, is it? Pray sit. There is a chair." "I prefer to stand, Your Grace," said the solicitor, who did not prefer it at all, but had been told in the curricle that standing would lend the occasion weight. "As you wish," said Julian. He did not invite Aldrich to sit. He let the silence in the hall do a little of his speaking for him, the silence of stone walls and old portraits and a fire that had been allowed to burn down to embers, so that the room was not warm and no part of the room pretended to be. "I will be plain," Aldrich said. "Miss Fairchild is my betrothed. The settlements are signed. The banns were to be read on Sunday next. She has broken no engagement in writing. She has sent me no letter of release, and her removal from Pembroke House in the dead of night amounts in the strictest reading of the law to abduction. Mr. Paget will confirm it." Mr. Paget coughed and confirmed it, in a voice that wished it were elsewhere. "You are free," said Julian, "to attempt an abduction charge in the courts." "I shall." "You will lose." "I think not, Your Grace." "You will lose," said Julian again, and his voice had dropped half a tone, which was worse, "because my first witness will be Miss Henrietta Pembroke, who will be called before the bench and asked upon her oath as a Christian gentlewoman to describe in plain English how Lord Aldrich Thorne occupied himself in the Pembroke Orangery on the evening of the 12th of this month, at approximately 10:30, against the third potted orange tree from the east door." Aldrich went the colour of old paper. "She will deny it," he said at last. "She will not," said Julian. "She is already, by the simplest rules of self-preservation, preparing to be the injured party in this story rather than the other one. My sister has written to her this morning. The letter will have reached Grosvenor Street by now. Miss Pembroke, one may confidently predict, is at this hour in some tears over a writing desk, composing a very moving account of how she was led astray by a faithless man." Mr. Paget, who had not been told about the orangery in the curricle, looked at his client with the expression of a man discovering that the roof of his hired lodging was not, after all, paid for. He took half a step away from Aldrich on the flags, as though distance were already a kind of defence, and he was observed to do so by Mr. Hodge, who observed most things. Aldrich tried another tack. He had a limited number of tacks, and he had never been clever about choosing between them. "Ravensmere," he said, lowering his voice. "We are both men of the world. The settlements were not ungenerous. I am prepared, that is to say, a gentleman's arrangement between us, a sum—" Julian laughed. It was not a long laugh. It was one dry sound, struck off once like a flint, and then gone, and in the great stone hall it echoed up the panelling and came back smaller, and Aldrich heard himself in it and flinched. "Get out of my house," said Julian. "Your Grace." "Walk," said Julian, "or be walked." Mr. Hodge had, it developed, come in behind them, and two of the larger grooms had come in behind Mr. Hodge, and Aldrich understood, with the slow understanding of a man who had never before been shown a door he could not prevaricate past, that the interview was concluded. He turned on his heel. The canary waistcoat flashed once in the grey light. "Mr." Paget followed him at a half-trot, clutching the leather case, and the curricle went down the avenue considerably faster than it had come up it, and the iron gates of Ravensmere closed behind it, with a sound Cordelia heard from the upper terrace, though she did not yet know what the sound meant. She had been standing at the balustrade with a shawl about her shoulders, watching the sky, and when the small black and yellow thing went away down the avenue, she had thought at first it was a pheasant, startled out of the covert. Only when she saw the canary of the waistcoat did she understand, and she stood a long moment with her hand on the cold stone, and did not move until the curricle was lost behind the chestnuts. She did not come down. She did not ask. Julian, in the hall below, did not send for her. He sat instead at his writing desk and drafted, in his own hand, a short note to his sister containing 3 instructions and 1 request, and he sealed it with the Raven's signet and gave it to Mr. Hodge without comment. By the end of the week, Miss Henrietta Pembroke had done precisely what Julian had predicted. She wrote to the London papers a long, sly letter, unsigned but not mysteriously so, in which a lady of the first circles lamented poor Miss F's unfortunate flight with a notorious duke, and hinted that the young woman had been seen in questionable company for months before the engagement ball. It was a pretty piece of work, and it was printed in 2 of the cheaper sheets, and for 2 days the drawing-rooms of Mayfair amused themselves with it. Then Lady Beatrix Ravensmere wrote hers. She wrote it at the little walnut desk in the morning-room at Ravensmere Hall, in her clear, upright hand, with Cordelia sewing quietly by the window and pretending not to listen to the scratch of the pen. Beatrix's letter named no names, but it required none. It observed, with a widow's dry civility, that when a young lady of impeccable breeding was removed from her guardian's house by a gentleman who was her late father's nearest friend and her late mother's executor, when she was received at his country seat by his elder sister, a respectable matron of 38, when she was accommodated in apartments that had once been a duchess's, and when the outcry against this arrangement came loudest from the very cousin who had lately been observed at private interviews with the young lady's affianced husband. Then the world, said Lady Beatrix, might be forgiven for wondering which party in this drama had most need of its charity. She signed her full name. She sent it to the Morning Post. It was printed on the Tuesday. By the Thursday the tide had turned. By the Saturday there were jokes about bees in Mayfair, and a caricature appeared in a print-shop window in St. James's showing a gentleman in a yellow waistcoat, pursued through an orangery by a swarm of his own buttons, which sold out its first impression by noon. By the following Monday, old Mr. Withers, who had been the Fairchild family solicitor for 30 years, and who had loved Cordelia's father like a younger brother, sat down at his rooms in Lincoln's Inn, and wrote a short letter to Miss Cordelia Fairchild at Ravensmere Hall, offering his services, without fee, without question, and without apology for the long silence in which, he confessed, shame on his own account had kept him. He had known, he wrote, the character of the young man to whom her aunt had affianced her. He had protested at the time. He had been overruled and told that he was an old man grown fanciful, and he had withdrawn, and he was sorry for it, and he would not withdraw again. Cordelia wept over that letter. It was the first letter she had wept over in 3 years. Something in her had begun to change. It was not a single thing. It was a series of small things, each so quiet that she did not notice them at the time. She rode out every morning with Beatrix on a dappled grey mare named Juno, who had a kind mouth and a willingness to canter when asked, and the sharp north air put colour into Cordelia's cheeks that no rouge of Henrietta's had ever achieved. She took to the library. Julian's library at Ravensmere was immense, 3 floors of it, with a gallery and a spiral iron stair, and she wandered in it as a child might wander in a wood, pulling down volumes of Cowper and Mrs. Radcliffe and, once, a battered Ovid in which she found, in the margin, notes in a schoolboy's hand that could only have been Julian's at 15, and she sat a long time with that book in her lap and did not read it. She began a piece of embroidery, a small square of white linen, worked with a border of ivy and blue forget-me-nots, meant for the nursery cushion that little Sophie, Beatrix's daughter, would lean against when she was old enough to sit up for stories. Sophie was 2 and plump, and believed with passionate conviction that Cordelia had been sent to the house chiefly to hold her doll. The doll was named unaccountably Mr. Bunn. Mr. Bunn was very battered. Mr. Bunn required, at all hours, a lady's undivided lap. Cordelia stitched in the afternoons by the long south window, with the child dozing against her knee, and Mr. Bunn wedged between them, and she found that her hands, which had trembled for weeks after the ball, did not tremble now. She pricked her finger once on a careless stitch and watched the bright bead of blood gather on her fingertip, and laughed at herself for having forgotten the trick of the thimble. And Sophie, waking, held up a fat hand and kissed the wounded finger with a child's solemnity, and Cordelia felt something low and bruised inside her give a little and ease. And she laughed, once, at dinner. It was nothing Julian had meant to be clever about. He had been telling Beatrix, because Beatrix had asked, some small story about a neighbour's gouty spaniel that had bitten the bishop's gaiter at the midsummer fete, and he told it dryly, without emphasis, as he told everything, and at the end of it Cordelia laughed. It was a small laugh, and a startled one, as though she had surprised herself, and she put her hand to her mouth at once, because she had not laughed in company for months and had half forgotten the shape of it. When she lowered her hand and looked up, Julian was staring at her. He was not smiling. He was looking at her as a man looks at a window he has lived beside for a long while, and has only now, in a particular slant of evening light, realized was open, has been open, perhaps, all along, and through it he can see the garden. He recovered himself in an instant. He turned his attention to his wine. He did not speak again until the covers were removed. But something had been let into the room that had not been in the room before, and Beatrix, who missed very little, glanced from her brother to Cordelia and back again, and said nothing, and helped herself to a second slice of the apricot tart. A week after the curricle had gone down the avenue, a letter came for Cordelia in Aldrich's hand. It was a long letter. It was written on cream paper with a black border, as though he were in mourning for something, which in a manner of speaking he was. It ran to 6 pages of close script. In it he said that he had always loved her, that Henrietta had pursued him, not he her, that the evening in the orangery had been a moment of weakness from which he had woken with tears, that his affection for Cordelia was the one pure thing in a life otherwise ill-used, that he was sick with grief, that if she would only write to him one word, one kind word, he would lay himself at her feet and be her faithful servant for the rest of his days. He signed himself, in a flourish, "Your wretched Aldrich." Mr. Hodge carried the letter up on the breakfast tray. Julian had taken it from the morning's post and placed it beside the toast rack without a word. He did not mention it at breakfast. He did not ask afterward whether she had read it. He went out riding with his steward and did not return until 4. Cordelia read it once in bed, with her tea cooling at her elbow. She read it a second time, slowly, as though it were a page of bad French she was obliged to translate. Then she folded it neatly into thirds, rose in her nightdress, crossed the room to the fire that Mary had lit an hour before, and laid the pages, one by one, upon the coals. The black border caught first, the cream paper browned and curled and bloomed into brief yellow flame, and the flourish of "Your wretched Aldrich" blackened and went to ash, and Cordelia stood in her bare feet on the hearthrug and watched it all burn down to nothing. She did not cry. She had done her crying over Mr. Withers's letter. This one had not earned tears. It was in the garden, 2 afternoons later, that Beatrix told her. They had walked out after luncheon, because the sky had cleared at last, and the air smelled of cut grass and late roses. Beatrix wore her dove-grey silk with the black velvet at the hem. Cordelia had put on a pale blue muslin she had found in the press of her rooms, one of several gowns Beatrix had had made up for her in the first week without comment, and she had tied her honey-blonde hair with a ribbon that matched. They walked arm in arm along the yew walk, and the yews threw cool green shadow across the gravel, and Beatrix was silent for a long while, and then she said, without preamble, "You ought to know something, my dear. I have been turning it over for days whether to tell you, and I have concluded that it is not mine to keep." "What is it?" said Cordelia. "Julian has been in love with you for 3 years," said Beatrix. Cordelia stopped walking. A bee went past them in the hot afternoon. Somewhere beyond the yews, a gardener was clipping a hedge, and the shears made a small, patient rhythm. 3 years, Cordelia said. It was not a question. It was the word itself she was trying to hold. "Since your father's funeral," said Beatrix gently. "He went down into Hampshire to pay his respects. You will not remember him there. There was a great crowd, and he stood at the back of the churchyard and did not come forward. He told me of it afterward. He said that he had gone to say farewell to a man who had once saved his life in a river at Eton, and that he had found at the graveside a girl of 18 in black bombazine with her hair coming down out of its pins from the wind, and that she had not wept where anyone could see her, and that she had stood up very straight when they lowered the coffin, and that something in him had," he said the word quietly, "turned." Cordelia did not speak. "He came home," said Beatrix, "and he asked me 2 days later, who was the guardian of Miss Cordelia Fairchild. I told him it was her aunt, Mrs. Pemberton, and that an engagement was already whispered of with a young man named Thorne. He said nothing. You must understand my brother, my dear. He does not speak of such things. He went away to the north for a season, and I thought it had passed. It had not passed. He has watched over you at a distance ever since. He was the friend who persuaded Mr. Withers, when your aunt dismissed him, to keep your mother's jewels in trust against your majority. He was the reason the invitation to the Pembroke ball was answered at all. When I saw you at that ball, when I saw how the man beside you did not look at you once in an hour, I came home and told Julian it was time. I did not know then what he meant to do. I know now he had known for 6 months what Aldrich was, and had not been able to prove it to you, and had been half mad with not being able. They had begun to walk again, slowly because Cordelia's feet had started forward, without her giving them leave. Cordelia put a hand to her throat, as though there were a pearl there that wanted steadying, and found no pearl, only her own pulse. "He has never said so to me," Cordelia said at last. "No," said Beatrix. "He will not. He has told me in so many words that he will not lay a proposal upon a rescue. He thinks you would mistake gratitude for love, and he would rather have your truthful refusal than a grateful yes. He is an odd man, my brother. He is a stubborn one. He is the best man I have ever known." They reached the end of the yew walk. There was a stone bench there, warmed by the sun, and Cordelia sat down on it because her knees had lost their conviction. Beatrix sat beside her and took her hand, and held it, and did not press her to speak. Cordelia could not speak. She looked down the long green aisle of the yews, and saw, at the far end of it, a figure in a black coat walking the terrace above the rose garden, Julian, taking his afternoon turn, unaware that he was watched, and she thought of the churchyard in Hampshire 4 years ago, and of the wind in her hair as they lowered her father into the earth, and of the man she had not seen at the back of the crowd who had seen her, and had carried her image home with him, and had kept it silently for 3 years, as a man keeps a lit candle out of the wind with his hand. Her eyes filled. She did not brush the tears away. They fell onto the blue muslin of her gown, and made small dark marks there, and dried. And still she could not find a word for what she felt, and still Beatrix, beside her, said nothing at all. Cordelia returned from the garden with Beatrix's words lodged beneath her ribs like a splinter that would not be coaxed out. 3 years. He had looked at her for 3 years. She climbed the great staircase of Ravensmere Hall with her hand trailing the banister, and every portrait along the landing seemed to watch her pass with an expression of restrained knowledge, as though they had all been in on the thing and had only been waiting for her to discover it. She did not come down to dinner that night. She sent word by the chambermaid that she had a megrim and would take a little broth in her rooms. The broth cooled untouched upon the small japanned tray beside the fire. She sat before the grate in her dressing gown, with her hair unpinned, and she did not weep, for she had learned young that weeping mended nothing. She only turned the knowledge over in her mind as one turns a coin, looking first at the face of it and then at the reverse. 3 years meant the funeral. 3 years meant a tall, silent stranger at the edge of a churchyard in Hampshire, whom she had scarcely marked at the time, a gentleman in black who had bowed to her aunt and left without staying for the cold collation. 3 years meant that every cold civility of his since her arrival had been a discipline, not an indifference. 3 years meant that the carriage on Pembroke Lane had not been the impulsive chivalry of her father's friend, but the long, patient act of a man who had waited until he could offer her, not love, but liberty. She could not bear him in the morning. She did not know why. She only knew that when she imagined walking into the breakfast room and meeting his ice-blue eyes across the sideboard, her breath caught in the small of her throat and would not come out. So she did not go down. She took her chocolate in her rooms. She wrote a note to Beatrix, a courteous, careful note, saying that she was a little unwell, that she begged leave to keep to her apartments for a day or two, that she was very well cared for and needed nothing. She sent a second note, less easily composed, to the master of the house. Miss Fairchild presented her compliments to his Grace, and hoped he would forgive her absence at table. She was indisposed. She was in no want of a physician. She was very grateful for his continued hospitality. The note came back to her mind 100 times in the hours after she had dispatched it. Grateful for his continued hospitality. She winced at the phrase as at a false note struck in a drawing-room. Julian read it in the library, standing at the long window that gave onto the park, with the morning light hard on the black wool of his coat. He read it once and folded it and put it inside his waistcoat, against the pocket watch, and stood a long moment with his hand flat over the place where it lay. Then he rang for Hodge and said, in his usual level voice, that he would ride out at once, and would be in town by evening, and that he would return when he returned. Hodge, who had dressed him for 20 years, and who knew the set of his shoulders as a sailor knows the set of a sail, did not answer for a breath longer than was strictly proper. Then he said, "Very good, Your Grace," and went to fetch the travelling case. 4 days passed at Ravensmere Hall in a peculiar, muffled quiet. Cordelia came down only to walk in the shrubbery at the quietest hour of the afternoon, when she knew Beatrix would be with little Sophie in the nursery and the servants at their dinner. She ate in her sitting-room. She read, or tried to read. She wrote long letters to no one and burned them in the grate. She heard from her window the distant crunch of hoofs on gravel, and knew without looking that it was not the great black gelding Julian rode. Beatrix came up on the second evening and sat with her for an hour and spoke of nothing in particular. She did not mention the garden. She did not mention her brother. When she rose to go, she only pressed Cordelia's hand once, firmly, and said, "He would not have you distressed on his account. Whatever you decide, my dear, you decide freely. That has always been the whole of it." "I know," Cordelia said, and she did know, and the knowing did not ease her. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the scandal came up the drive in a coach and four with a curricle behind it, and 2 hired post-chaises after that, and a clatter of London voices at the door that Beatrix could hear from the morning-room before the bell was even rung. Henrietta Pembroke descended from the curricle in vivid coral-pink silk and a bonnet with 3 tall feathers, her dark ringlets bouncing at her temples, her colour high, with something that was neither rouge nor exertion, but a thin, bright panic. Behind her spilled out 4 ladies and a single London buck, a Mrs. Carisbrooke and a Miss Pettigrew, and the 2 Miss Brabazons and young Lord Rothsey, who would repeat at a dinner table anything his hostess wished repeated. They had been told, Henrietta had assured them in the inn at Hertford, that they were to witness a tender family reconciliation, that dear Cordelia had been held against her will by a rake of a duke these 3 weeks past, that Henrietta, as her only cousin and nearest female relation, had come to bring her home. Beatrix met them in the great hall in her dove-grey silk, with her hands folded at her waist and her warm grey eyes as cool as she had ever suffered them to be. "Miss Pembroke," she said, "I do not recall that you were expected." "Dear Lady Beatrix," Henrietta said, very bright, very loud, for the benefit of those behind her, "I have come for my cousin. I cannot imagine why she has not written to me. She must be quite overcome. My friends have been so kind as to accompany me, for a young woman cannot travel alone in these dreadful times. Where is she? I must go to her at once." "Miss Fairchild is at her leisure in this house," Beatrix said. "She receives whom she chooses. I will send word that you are come. You will be so good as to wait." But Henrietta was already past her, her coral pink skirt sweeping the flagstones, her feathers bobbing, and the London party behind her pressing in on a wave of scent and murmured curiosity. "The library, I dare say," Henrietta called over her shoulder. "She always did hide in libraries." Beatrix did not raise her voice. She only said to the footman at the door, very low, "Send a boy to the stables. His Grace is to be summoned from town." And then she followed the coral pink flood down the long corridor. Cordelia was at the library table with a volume of Cowper open before her, which she had not been reading. She heard the voices in the passage, Henrietta's in particular, which she would have known had she heard it at the bottom of a well. And she set the book down very carefully and closed it and laid her hands flat upon its cover. She did not rise. The double doors banged open. Henrietta came in first, feathers trembling, a handkerchief already pressed to her mouth as though she had been weeping, though she had not. "Cordelia," she cried. "Oh, my dearest Cordelia, what has he done to you?" The London party assembled behind her in the doorway like a little theatre audience. Mrs. Carisbrooke leaned on Lord Rothsey's arm. Miss Pettigrew craned her neck. The Miss Brabazons had forgotten to shut their mouths. Beatrix stood at the back, with her arms folded and her face composed, and she did not intervene, because she had seen in the set of Cordelia's shoulders, as Cordelia sat with her hands upon Cowper, something she had not seen before. "Henrietta," Cordelia said, "do come in." "You poor creature," Henrietta said, moving forward with both hands outstretched. "You are so pale. You have been used most shamefully. Come, come. We have a carriage. We shall have you in London by tomorrow. And I have spoken to Aunt Pemberton. And between us we shall contrive." "Contrive what?" Cordelia said. The question was quiet, and it stopped Henrietta as though a hand had been laid across her mouth. "Why, your return, my love. Your restoration. You must see that a young woman who has lived 3 weeks alone in the house of a bachelor duke—" "His sister lives in this house," Cordelia said, "and his sister's daughter, and some 30 servants. I have not in 3 weeks been alone in a room with his Grace above 4 times, and never for longer than the quarter of an hour it takes to pour tea." "Well, but the world will not—" "The world will hear what you have told it," Cordelia said, "and what you have told it, cousin, is that I ran away with a lover." Henrietta's cheek went a peculiar white beneath the rouge. "I never—" "You did," Cordelia said. "You told Miss Pettigrew so. In Hookham's, on the 23rd. Miss Pettigrew is standing behind you at this moment." Miss Pettigrew, who had been standing behind her, went the colour of new brick and stared hard at the carpet. "I have been very patient, Henrietta," Cordelia said. She had not raised her voice. "I have been patient all my life. I think I shall not be patient any longer. You have come into this house uninvited with witnesses to make a scene. Very well. You shall have your scene, but you shall have it truthfully. Cordelia. On the night of our engagement ball, Cordelia said, and her voice was perfectly steady, I walked into the orangery at Pembroke House and found my betrothed with his hand inside the bodice of your gown and his mouth upon yours. You were not surprised to find him there. You had arranged to be found there, though not, I think, by me. Mrs. Carisbrooke made a small, involuntary sound. Lord Rothsey shifted his weight. That is a wicked. My aunt then informed me, Cordelia said over her, that I was to marry him in any case, because the settlements were signed, and because she would not have the family shamed for what she was pleased to call a kitchen-maid rumour. I believe the phrase was hers. You used it to me the following morning in the corridor when you told me, with some pride, Henrietta, that you had been Aldrich's lover for a year, and that you intended to remain so, and that I was to be installed in the country and visited at quarter days. This is monstrous. You wrote him letters, Cordelia said. Those affectionate notes my aunt had from him when she grew anxious about his absences. The ones in his hand, supposedly, full of his regard for me. They were not in his hand. They were in yours, in a bad imitation of his. I found one in my aunt's workbox. The G betrays you, cousin. You never could make a proper G. The library was very quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a long case clock struck the half-hour. As to the settlements, Cordelia said, I had a letter, 4 days ago, from Mr. Tilney, who was my father's solicitor and is now mine. The settlements have been frozen on the application of the Fairchild trustees, pending an inquiry into the conduct of the intended husband. Aldrich cannot touch a penny of my portion. He never will. There is, I am told, a further action pending in respect of certain debts he has contracted on the expectation of that portion. I do not imagine he will continue in England much longer. You little, Henrietta said, in a voice that no longer resembled the bright one she had come in with. I am not finished, Cordelia said. You came here to tell these ladies that I had been used and abandoned. I have been used, Henrietta, but it was not by his Grace of Ravensmere. I was used by my aunt, who sold me, and by the man I was told to marry, who lied to me, and by you, who were my only cousin, and who watched me being sold, and smiled and helped. She rose at last, and she was not tall, and her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but her voice did not. You will leave this house now, she said. You will take your friends with you. What you choose to say of me in London you must say. I no longer think I care. But you will say it now, knowing that I have said this. And these ladies and this gentleman have heard me. And I do not imagine, Henrietta, that by Sunday there will be a drawing-room in Grosvenor Square that has not heard it also. Henrietta stared at her. Her mouth worked. No sound came out of it. Good afternoon, cousin, Cordelia said. Beatrix stepped aside from the doorway. Henrietta passed her without a word. The London party went after her in a rustling, scandalised silence, Miss Pettigrew stumbling a little over the threshold, Mrs. Carisbrooke already whispering behind her hand to Lord Rothsey before they had gained the hall. The outer door shut. There was the crunch of wheels upon gravel. Then there was nothing. Cordelia sat down again. She had not, after all, risen for long. She folded her hands upon the closed volume of Cowper, and she looked at her folded hands as though she had never before seen them, and Beatrix, who had come and laid a hand upon her shoulder, said nothing at all, which was the finest kindness she had ever done her. By nightfall the carriage had reached Hertford. By morning Mrs. Carisbrooke was at Lady Sefton's breakfast table. By the evening of the second day, the story of what had been said in the library at Ravensmere Hall had been heard in 3 drawing-rooms in Mayfair. By the following Sunday, it had been told, with varying embellishments, in 20. In none of those tellings did Miss Cordelia Fairchild come off worse than she went in. Lady Sefton herself, who had known Cordelia's mother when both were girls and had danced with her father at the King's last birthday, set down her teacup at the conclusion of Mrs. Carisbrook's recital and said in her dry contralto, "Well, she is her father's daughter then." I had wondered all those years in that dreadful lavender drawing-room if anything of him had survived. And she took up her teacup again and drank, and the story she had just heard began, from that moment, its quieter second life, the one that ran not through the gossips, but through the drawing-rooms of Cordelia's mother's friends. And those were the drawing-rooms in London that, though they met less often and talked less loudly, still, in the end, decided matters. She did not know any of that yet. She sat in the library as the afternoon faded into a grey spring dusk, and she did not move. Beatrix brought her a cup of tea, and then went away. A housemaid came in and lit the candles and drew the curtains and went away. The fire burned down, and a footman laid fresh coals and went away. Cordelia sat. It was near 10 o'clock when she heard the hoofs on the drive. She did not turn her head. She heard the great door opened, and a murmur of voices in the hall, Hodges, and another, low and known. She heard boots upon the marble, and then upon the Turkey carpet of the corridor, and then the library door opened and closed again very softly. Julian had come straight from the road. His coat was dark with the damp of a long ride, and there was a small cut upon his knuckle where he had struck it against something, and his hair was disordered where he had pushed his hand through it. He did not speak. He crossed the room to where she sat in the great wing chair beside the hearth, and he did not stand over her, and he did not take the opposite chair. He knelt beside her chair. He did it without ceremony, as a man kneels to mend a thing that has broken on the floor. His height brought his face nearly level with hers even so. "Miss Fairchild," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He was silent a moment. Then he said, "Beatrix has told me what passed this afternoon." "Yes," she said. "I should have been here," he said. "No," she said. I think it was better that you were not." He inclined his head slightly, accepting that. "I did not come to you these 4 days past," he said, "because I thought you wished not to be come to. I hope I was not wrong." "You were not wrong," she said. "Cordelia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name. "I came back from town to say one thing. Will you hear it?" "Yes," she said. He drew a small breath. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, not formidable at all, but a man who had ridden 30 miles with a speech prepared, and had discovered, on arrival, that he did not know how to begin it. "You owe me nothing," he said. "Not the hospitality of this house, nor the carriage, nor any part of what has been done. A carriage will be at your door tomorrow at whatever hour you name. You may go to Hampshire or to Bath, or to my Aunt Cavendish in Yorkshire, who would love to have you, or to a house of your own, which Mr. Tilney and I can contrive between us within a week. There will be a settlement, a sufficient one, that you may live as you choose to live, and marry whom you choose to marry, or never marry at all, and no voice in this house will be raised against any of it." "Julian," she said very quietly. "I have not finished," he said. "Whether you go in the morning or whether you stay, and whether you marry me or whether you do not, I shall spend the rest of my life in your service. That is the whole of the thing. I tell it to you plainly because I think plain telling is what you have been owed, and have not had." She did not speak at once. She looked down at him where he knelt, at the line of his jaw, at the grey threaded lately into the black hair at his temple, at the hand that rested, very carefully, not upon her hand, but upon the arm of her chair, an inch from it. "Why did you never tell me," she said, "that you loved me?" He did not flinch from the word. He met her eyes. "Because I could not," he said, "give you a proposal upon the back of a rescue. If I had asked you in the carriage, or the first morning, or the week after, you would have said yes out of gratitude, or out of fear, or because you had nowhere else to put yourself, and you would have been my wife. And I should never have known, to my dying day, whether you had chosen me or only chosen shelter. I would not have you mistake gratitude for love, Cordelia, nor obligation for freedom. I thought, God forgive me, that if I were patient enough, you might in time come to a place where you could tell me one from the other. Beatrix was less patient than I. She thought you ought to be told. She may have been right. I do not yet know. 3 years, she said. 3 years, he said. Since the funeral. Since the funeral. She looked at him a long moment. The fire made a small sound in the grate. Somewhere in the house a door was closed very gently, and there was the muted tread of Hodge, who would be drawing a bath his master would not yet take. "Julian," she said, "I cannot answer you tonight." "I did not ask you to," he said. "I will give you an answer," she said, "in a fortnight." He bowed his head. He did not take her hand. He did not kiss it. He did not ask her for anything at all. "A fortnight," he said. "Thank you." He rose to his feet. He stood beside her chair a breath longer, looking down at her honey-blonde hair where it caught the firelight, at her small hands folded upon Cowper, at the steady profile he had first seen at 18 in a Hampshire churchyard and had carried in his chest, unasked, ever since. He did not touch her. He did not press her. Then he bowed, a proper bow, such as he would have made her in a drawing-room. And he walked to the library door, and he let himself out, and he closed it behind him without a sound. Cordelia sat on in the wing chair beside the dying fire. The library was very quiet. She did not know, yet, what she would say to him in a fortnight. She only knew, sitting there in the warm dark with the smell of beeswax and old leather about her, that for the first time since her father had been buried, no one in the world was pushing her anywhere at all. The fortnight that followed was the strangest of Cordelia Fairchild's life, for it was the first in which nothing was demanded of her. No aunt summoned her to the morning-room to correct her posture. No fiancé called upon her with his thin-lipped smile and a list of dinners she was to grace. No cousin whispered at her elbow, coaxing and wounding by turns. The long corridors of Ravensmere Hall kept their own counsel, and so did its master. He did not seek her in the library. He did not linger at the foot of the stairs in the hope of meeting her upon the landing. He rode out at dawn as he had always done, dined at the far end of the long oak table as he had always done, and passed her in the gallery with nothing more than a grave inclination of his dark head. She understood, at last, what he had offered her. Not courtship, not patience dressed up as courtship. Simple space, the first clear air she had breathed since she was 16. She walked the grounds. Beyond the terrace the lawn sloped down to a small lake fringed with alders, and beyond that lay a beechwood where the bluebells had begun to push their green spears through the leaf mould. In the morning she took a shawl and a book, and sat upon the stone bench by the water, and did not always read. Often she watched the reflections move upon the surface, and thought of nothing at all, which was, she discovered, a luxury she had never before possessed. She wrote letters to the family solicitor, thanking him for his continued kindness and asking in a postscript that a portion of her mother's income be settled upon the old nurse in Devonshire who had once sung her to sleep and whom no one had remembered to pension, to an old governess in Yorkshire whom she had not seen since she was 13, and whose small, neat replies, when they came, would prove to be among the happiest surprises of the season. To Beatrix's little Sophie, away with a country cousin, a letter full of small drawings of ducks and a promise that there would be a ribbon for her upon her return. To her father's old gamekeeper at the Fairchild estate in Wiltshire, whom she had always loved, to say that she was well, and not to believe anything he had read. She did not write to her aunt. She did not write to Aldrich. She did not know yet whether she would write to Julian, or whether she would simply go to him one evening and tell him what she had decided. She read. She had never, in her own opinion, truly read before. She had been taught to embroider and to play upon the pianoforte and to recite French verses at her aunt's dinners, but the Pembroke Library had been a small, thin thing of sermons and etiquette manuals, and Cordelia had not known until she came to Ravensmere what a library might be. Julian's was a long room panelled in oak, with a gallery running round the upper level and a pair of globes by the fire, and it held, she counted one rainy afternoon, and then left off counting, above 6,000 volumes. She read Cowper in the mornings, and a little Gibbon in the afternoons, and one evening, having taken down a volume at random, she read the whole of Mrs. Radcliffe's The Italian in a single sitting, and had to be reminded by a concerned housemaid to come down to supper. The housemaid, upon being thanked, curtsied and went away smiling, and Cordelia understood, with a small jolt, that even the servants in this house had begun to wish her well. She took tea with Beatrix in the small green parlour that faced east, and Beatrix, who had a great fund of discretion beneath her briskness, spoke of the gardens, of the tenants, of a pair of novels lately arrived from Mr. Hatchard's shop, and of nothing else. Once, upon the 6th day, Beatrix said, quite mildly over the teapot, "He has not asked after you, you know. Not even of me." "I know," Cordelia said. "He will not," Beatrix said. "He would sooner bite off his tongue." "I know that too," said Cordelia, and her cornflower blue eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears. Beatrix reached across the small table and laid her warm hand over Cordelia's cold one, and said no more. It was, Cordelia thought afterwards, the clearest kindness she had ever received from another woman. Her aunt had pressed her. Henrietta had flattered and watched her. Governesses had drilled her. The London matrons had assessed her at a glance and labelled her like a parcel and sent her on. Beatrix alone had set her down and then stepped back and let her be. It was, perhaps, what it was to have a sister, though Cordelia had never had one and would not have dared to claim the word now. The news from London came by degrees. Mr. Hodge brought up the papers each morning, folded upon a silver salver. Beatrix read them first. Cordelia read them after. Lord Aldrich Thorne, it appeared, had been observed at the Dover packet in a state of some disorder, accompanied by 2 trunks and no servant, and had taken ship for Ostend. His creditors had descended upon his London lodgings by Thursday. The settlements, Mr. Gidding had frozen upon Cordelia's behalf, would not be loosed again in his lifetime. The Fairchild fortune, safe in the hands of its proper trustee, would go, as her father had always intended, to her alone. Of Henrietta, the reports were crueller, though they were written in the honeyed language of the Morning Post. Miss Pembroke had not been received at Lady Sefton's. Miss Pembroke had been obliged to withdraw from Almack's. Miss Pembroke had at length departed town, it was understood, for the country seat of a cousin in Bath. The cousin, Cordelia knew, was an elderly widow with a small income and a pug, and Henrietta would be reduced to sharing a back bedroom and reading aloud in the evenings. It was, in its way, a more thorough punishment than any Cordelia could have devised, and Cordelia found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it gave her no pleasure. Julian did not speak of any of this at dinner. If the papers had come to him before they came to Cordelia, he made no mention of it. If a letter arrived for him from town with fresh intelligence, and Cordelia, passing his study one morning, saw upon the salver an envelope in the unmistakable hand of Mr. Gidding, the solicitor. He did not bring it to her. She understood that he had set himself a rule, and would not break it. He would not use the fall of her enemies to move her 1 inch towards him. The decision was to be hers, made in clean air. Mrs. Pembroke's letter came on the 9th day. It was written in a hand that trembled and crossed, and it spoke at great length of motherly concern, of misunderstandings, of the regrettable impetuosity of young girls, and the affection which, whatever Cordelia's present feelings, her aunt had always borne her. Cordelia read it through once, standing by the library window. She folded it. She laid it in the small rosewood box on the writing desk, where she kept letters she did not intend to answer, and she closed the lid. On the 11th day, she asked for the carriage. The village churchyard lay 4 miles to the north, beside a squat Norman church with a yew tree older than the Conqueror. Cordelia had not set foot in it since she was 16. The graves of Mr. and Mrs. Fairchild stood side by side beneath a plain grey stone, carved with no more than their names and dates, and the single line her father had chosen for both of them before his death. In certain hope. The grass had been cut recently. A small posy of wild primroses had been laid at the foot of the stone, and withered there in the late spring sun. "You did not put those there, I think," Cordelia said to the coachman, who had remained a few paces behind her. "No, miss. His Grace rode out on Sunday, I believe." She was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "I shall be some time. You may wait at the lych gate." She stood before the stone a long while. She did not weep. She had wept for them enough, years since, when weeping had been a lonely and useless thing. Now she only spoke to them in her mind, as she had not been able to speak to them in 4 years. She told her father that his friend had been kind, that he had been kinder, perhaps, than any other soul she had met since her father died, that he was a difficult man, and a silent one, and that she believed she had come at last to trust him. She told her mother that she was wearing her ring. She said last of all, very quietly and aloud, "I think I should like to be happy, if you will let me." The yew above her moved a little in the wind, and a blackbird sang in the hedge, and that was all the answer the world made her, which was answer enough. She knelt at last and laid her gloved hand upon the carved letters of her father's name, and felt, beneath the kidskin, the warm, rough grain of the stone. She had been a frightened 16-year-old the last time she had stood here. She was a different woman now. She did not know quite at what hour she had become that woman, but she thought she might have become her somewhere between a stranger's black carriage in a foggy lane and a silent terrace at dusk. She returned to Ravensmere Hall in the late afternoon. The lodge-keeper's wife curtsied at the gate as the carriage passed. The elm avenue threw its long green shadows across the drive. At the top of the rise, the grey stone of the great house came into view with its 1,000 small windows reflecting a sky turning gold. And Cordelia, looking at it from the carriage window, understood with a small, soft shock that she was glad to see it. That she had been glad this last quarter hour at the thought of seeing it. That in some quiet, unnoticed way, between one day and the next, the word home had shifted in her chest from a house in Mayfair where she had never been loved to this great sombre pile of stone where she had been let alone. She did not tell anyone. She went up to her rooms and took off her bonnet and sat by the window until the dressing bell rang for dinner. And she knew. The 12th day, she passed almost entirely in the library, but not in reading. She had taken down the small edition of Herbert's poems that belonged to Julian, and she had opened it upon her knee. But the book lay open at the same page for most of an hour, and she did not see it. She was thinking of a man who dined at the far end of a long table and never looked at her when she crossed the room and looked at her whenever she did not cross it. She was thinking of the difference between what she had been taught to call love, the flattery, the calculation, the squeezed hand in a corridor, and what she had begun, in his silent company, to suspect love actually was. She had been taught to choose a husband. She had never been taught that a husband might be chosen because one could not, having seen him plainly, choose otherwise. The 13th day dawned warm. She spent it in the rose walk, cutting blooms for the hall table, and she spoke very little even to Beatrix, who watched her with grey eyes that understood a great deal and said nothing. At noon, Beatrix found her sitting upon the low stone wall with a basket of roses at her feet and her head bent, and did not disturb her. At 4, she came down dressed for the evening, and Beatrix looked at her once, saw what was in her face, and turned aside to hide her own. At dusk she walked out onto the south terrace. The sun had gone behind the beechwood, and the sky above the lake was the colour of a pale apricot. The stone flags were still warm under her slippers. At the far end of the terrace, where the balustrade turned and looked down upon the sunken garden, a tall figure stood alone, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark head bare. He was looking at nothing in particular. He often stood there, she knew. Beatrix had told her so, many weeks ago when Cordelia had first arrived and had asked where the Duke went in the evenings. He goes out to the terrace, Beatrix had said. He has always done so. He likes the quiet. Cordelia crossed the flags without hurry. Her slippers made no sound. He did not turn at her approach, though she knew, by a small tightening at the corner of his jaw, that he had heard her. She did not speak. She came up to his side, and she slipped her hand through the crook of his arm, and she let it rest there. Julian Ravensmere drew a breath so slow and so careful that she felt it pass through the whole long line of him. He did not look down at her. He did not cover her hand with his. He only, very gently, as though he were afraid the gesture might startle some small wild thing into flight, drew her hand a fraction closer into the warmth of his side, and began, at her own pace, to walk. They went the length of the terrace in silence. At the far end, he turned and they came back. A thrush was singing somewhere in the limes. The first star pricked out above the east gable of the hall. "Cordelia," he said at last, and it was the first time he had ever used her given name aloud. "Yes," she said. That was all. He understood her, and she understood him, and the fortnight was over. They were married on a Tuesday morning, 18 days later, in the small private chapel that stood at the east end of Ravensmere Hall, and had stood there since the reign of the first Charles. No notice was sent to the London papers. No invitations crossed the country in silver salvers. No great-aunts travelled up from Hampshire with their reticules and their opinions. The pews were empty, but for 4 souls. Lady Beatrix Ravensmere sat in the first pew on the left, in a gown of dove-grey silk with black velvet trim, her silver locket at her throat, and her warm grey eyes uncommonly bright. Mr. Samuel Hodge, valet of some 20 years' service to the Duke, sat very straight in the first pew on the right, in his plain black coat and his neat white cravat, his weathered hands folded upon his knee. Behind him, in the second pew, sat the housekeeper Mrs. Gadsby and the head gardener Mr. Trent, 2 servants of the house who had been invited by Julian himself in a short note the day before, and who had come in their Sunday best and sat with the solemnity of persons attending a coronation. The rector was an old man with a cracked, soft voice who had christened Julian himself 34 years before. Cordelia wore a plain white muslin gown with a high waist and a narrow ivory ribbon beneath the bust. No embroidery, no flounce, no spangle. Her mother's pearls, not the choker from the ball. for she had left that in London to be buried with another life, but a longer single strand that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before her lay warm against her throat. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned simply at the crown, and a single white rose from the rose walk had been set above her ear. Her gloves were plain white kid. On the smallest finger of her left hand, she wore her father's gold signet, as she had done since she was 16. Julian wore a plain dark coat of midnight wool, cut without flourish, a plain white cravat, tied in the simplest of knots, and no pin at all. Only the heavy gold ring with its stylized raven remained upon his right hand. He was she saw the bell. She had honey-blonde curls that caught the sun the way wheat catches it in August, and cornflower blue eyes beneath thick, dark lashes, and a small, determined mouth, and she was making for the tall, dark man who knelt at the far end of the hearthrug with his hands held out. She reached him by a series of small, staggering rushes, and he caught her and lifted her high against his dark coat and pressed his mouth into the soft curls at her temple. "There, my Eleanor," he said. Eleanor for her mother's mother. "There, my clever girl." Cordelia, watching from the window seat with her sewing in her lap, thought what she had not thought in 4 years, which was that she had been given, in the end, not the vindication of the betrayal she had suffered, nor any revenge upon the cousin who had wronged her, nor even the lifting of a scandal from her name. She had been given only the small, quiet right, long denied her, to choose the life that had been waiting for her all along.